Today we slap mud on our road wheels and tracks. And also on the hull and fenders, but in a different color. We also slap some dust on it. And I try to not completely ruin the rusty exhausts. What's up guys, and welcome back to our tiny tiger. Today it's finally time to dive into the final stage in our painting process, weathering and mud. It's probably the part of the hobby I am most nervous about, since there's always this looming possibility to completely ruin the paint job. And it's my first time to weather a subject in this scale, so I was even more insecure about my approach. Luckily, I also decided to completely deviate from my regular workflow, which always can bring additional problems into the mix. And oh boy, did it bring them. But instead of subtle foreshadowing, let us jump right in. My first step before I could start with any of the weathering was to paint the tarps I base coated in black the last time. For this I chose Admiral Grey and Deck Grey from Ionic. The Admiral Grey is pretty close to the field grey that was used at that time, and the Deck Grey is going to be the highlight color that I will mix into the field grey. I started by applying a generous base coat all over the tarps until they had a decent coat of the color. You can let the black show through the paint if you want, which can add the illusion of deeper shadows and dirt in the recessed areas. After that, I mixed a tiny drop of the Deck Grey into the mix for the highlight and went over all the raised and flat areas of the tarps. I tried to not paint too much into the recessed parts to keep them darker. As you can see, I did not try to get a 100% perfect opacity everywhere, and it's honestly not a problem because now I get the color black-brown out to create a darker mix of the field grey for the shadows. I thinned this mixture a bit more to get it to a heavy glaze-like consistency and applied it in several thin coats all over the tarps. If you get too much over the highlight areas or the mid-tones, don't worry, that will be an easy fix later. The main goals is to unify all colors and get deeper, darker shadows that are not entirely black. And now I just reapply the highlight color until I'm happy with the result. In this scale you can go pretty heavy with the contrast and it won't be a problem. As you can see, that was quick, easy, and the result is the perfect basis for more weathering later. But now let's go to the actual main topic, and probably the reason you clicked on this video. The mud! I wanted to try VMS texture pigments together with their alkyd binder to create a more in-scale texturized mud paste. It's fairly easy. I just grab a few brushes full of each of the colors, shovel them in a small metal bowl for mixing, and add a bit of the alkyd binder. Heads up regarding the alkyd binder, unfortunately I only had the matte drying one. If you decide to replicate this, get the wet effect one. I'll probably fix this if I decide to create a small vignette for this tank with some gloss varnish. Anyway, I start with applying the paste all over the tracks and road wheels. The effect can easily be adjusted with regular enamel thinner or mineral spirit, the same way you would do with regular enamel paints. I have used the AK Dark Earth Diorama Effect paste on my 1/35th scale projects in the past, which can be blended and thinned with water and could have done probably the same here. But since I have planned something different for later weathering effects, I wanted to try this approach instead. I also thought it would look a bit more in scale, but I think it does not matter that much. I mixed a bit of AK Wet Mud Splatter effect into the mix and added this all over the areas where the mud was applied. I thought this would bring a bit more of the typical wet mud shininess back, but most of it was probably overpowered by the matte effect of the Alkyd binder. Props to VMS. If matte is on their product, it really holds up. Anyway, you can either do the same or just buy the wet effect binder and just apply more of the paste all over the tank. Either way will work, I guess, and just result in a different finish or effect. So decide for yourself if you want to skip this part or follow my steps if you like the outcome. If you don't experiment, you can't discover cool new effects, right? And now I just blend it with enamel thinner or mineral spirit until I find the outcome, well, acceptable, I guess. It's for you to decide how heavy you want the mud effect to be on your tank, but I imagined it being on the eastern front, which was known for the muddy conditions. Not yet satisfied with the final result, I reactivated the AK Wet Mud Effect paint and splattered it all over the running gear and the lower hull to make it look like fresh muddy splatters. And then proceeded with another enamel paint with a slightly different mud brown color, just to add a bit of color variation into the mix. They are applied all over the same areas as before, and I proceeded to then blend them with the rest to integrate them into the muddy effect. I think a bit of color variation goes a long way with these effects. The final result was not completely dry, so it still looked a bit shiny, but dried completely flat. Next came the biggest screw up for me personally during the whole build, apart from the whole tank disassembling itself during the painting and weathering process: the rusty exhausts. I somehow thought that just painting a few acrylic rust tones with a sponge and brush all over the exhausts would make for a cool effect, and yeah, it was a total disaster. So much that I was at one stage completely sure that I would just bin the whole tank and pretend it never was a thing. Even my attempt to rectify it with a few applications of dark grey and dark yellow dots, with which I had intended to depict paint residue or bare metal, completely failed, and I was totally disappointed. But it was too early to give up, so I just stopped at some point to make a plan and proceeded with something different. You've probably already heard about gouache paints from AK. Gouache paints are acrylic-based colors and can be reactivated with water for interesting effects. I wanted to try them since they came out, and I thought this would be the perfect situation for testing them. You can just smack them on your wet palette or thin them in a small bowl with water and can be mixed with each other without any problems, which gives you a lot of freedom for different tones and effects. I mixed them with a bit of water and just slapped them on where I wanted the hull to have remnants of already old and dried out mud. You don't need to be very precise with them, since they are easily blended with a bit of water and a brush. Only some degree of patience is needed before you'll be able to manipulate them again, and you maybe need to repeat the application and blending process a few times until you have the desired result. In hindsight, I would use this paint next time to create the first stage of weathering effects, like dust and old dried out mud remains, before using enamel paints and effects, because they won't get reactivated by these products. But well, you never know if you don't try, I guess. One thing I noticed with these paints, especially with the light dust color you see right now, was that there were a lot of places where big lumps of the dried pigments remained all over the tank. I can imagine that, especially with the lighter colored paints, the size of the pigments is pretty big, and therefore it maybe makes more sense to reserve this effect for 1/35 scale projects. But maybe it's also just a skill issue. Could also be possible, considering all the small setbacks I had during this stage of the project. Wouldn't be my kind of hobbying if there weren't any. As you can see, I wanted to achieve a streaking or rain mark effect on the vertical areas of the hull, so I used a comb brush to create this effect. Overall, I was a bit disappointed, again, with the effect, and I also think that the dust color is a bit too white for my taste. But the good thing is that at any time, if you don't like the effect, you can literally just wash it away with a decent amount of water. For the flat areas all over the hull and turret of the Tiger, I just used a regular round brush and blended the gouache paint with a stippling motion, pretty much the same way like I would when using the oil dot technique. Interestingly enough, this went far smoother in my opinion, and I like the result quite a bit more compared to the streaks and rain marks. But you can decide for yourself if you agree with me. Overall, the experience will probably result for me personally in going back to my old trusty oil paints for the next model. But then an idea struck me. Would I be able to save the exhausts with the rust colors I put in the cart when I ordered the paints? So I just started slapping on the paint, just slightly diluted with water, like a maniac all over the exhausts, because how could I ruin it more than I did already? At this point, I used the old rust and medium rust color to get a feeling for the effect, before I would consider using the light or fresh rust color, which would stand out even more if this failed too. Like I said, I didn't even think too much about where I put what color or how thick it actually was. I had no real hope to get this part back to something I would look at and be somewhat happy with. Thinking back, I was in exactly the kind of downward spiral of thought that we actually want to escape from by pursuing our hobbies. Nevertheless, at least for me, when I don't meet my own expectations of myself, I can become extremely frustrated and then also lose my concentration, which inevitably leads to more mistakes or simply makes them stand out even more. But to my surprise, and probably because I had nothing to lose with going completely crazy on the failed paint job, it actually started to look decent. After starting the blending process, the gouache rust colors made the work I did before look somewhat coherent, although arguably a bit too heavy probably, but that is a topic for another discussion. I reserve realism for the bigger scale models. Also notice the silver cartridge case on the engine deck? Yeah, that was the Atom brass color completely failing on me and turning out more silver than anything else. It really is this kind of project, I guess. Well, at least the exhausts turned out okay after all. Can't have everything, can ya? The final step for me was to glue back one of the two Bosch headlights I had lost somewhere during the painting process and I was able to find again. The other one will probably forever live in the carpet under my painting desk. But honestly, I was just happy to wrap the project at this point. And that pretty much wraps up this video and the Tiny Tiger project. Honestly, I am a bit disappointed with how it turned out, but that is my own fault. Instead of sticking to familiar and proven techniques, I tried out new effects and colors and had to learn the hard way. There was a point during the last few hours working on this tank when I just wanted to get it done, and unfortunately, I can see that when I look at it. The model itself and the scale impressed me massively, even though, in my opinion, many things are much more difficult in the process than with larger models. However, the construction speed and theoretically quick paint job of such a model, as well as the incredible attention to detail by the manufacturer Vespid Models, were quite impressive. I will probably go back to the 1/35th scale next, for which I already have an idea for a small diorama. But let's wait and see which project I decide on next. Maybe you have a suggestion? Maybe you want to see me create a display vignette for the Tiger? If so, just write it in the comments. Whatever it will be, let me know. So, I hope you enjoyed watching this video and I'm looking forward to hear your opinions on the results. Until then, have a great time and I hope to see you all soon. Bye bye!